Right. This is about um, a thing that's termed the mind-body problem. I'm making this because, I see a lot of people talking about who we are. Are we spirits? Do we have a soul? What happens when you die? And obviously these are big questions, and they're big questions that I've always asked. Um, and again, really, I think if we can find really where we are, that's going to help us to understand a lot more about who we are, and what being conscious actually is, and what it is. So I'm just going to, when I finish speaking, I'm going to just put up a couple of clips. Um, that's just a kind of overview and some of the stuff that I get involved in, that the questions, the journey that the questions took me on. Some of the language and the words that are used, if you type them in just so that you know what they are, because some things like epiphenomenalism and some of the terms, physicalism, and you know, easier for you to understand if you just type them in and look. Um, so it's termed the mind body problem. You know, do we have a soul? It basically comes down to, for me, if I can put it in words like you know basic words, for me it's like, you know, does matter, like the brain, produce consciousness, or is matter being produced by consciousness? Or you know and this question for me now changes. If you're basing it from living on a globe, there's a whole set, a line of thinking coming from that, because people take into account the Big Bang. How does it come about? How does that place us within it? And a lot of that's pushed by a thing called materialism, philosophical materialism. And that's pretty much where science is at, where matter has to be the primary force, and then they're trying to give explanations from then forward. And no taking into consideration that maybe mind was before matter. It's an interesting discussion, and obviously the questions: do you have a soul? Am I a soul? This is the path that took me down. So again, it's like, are you just a robot? And your consciousness, and the stuff that I'm going to post up will explain, what the hard problem of consciousness, i.e., what it is to experience. Um, Whether that's just a result of what the matter is doing, or whether it's like a dualist view, whether you're some sort of soul meshed with the body. And there's loads of varying arguments and debates about all that stuff, and it's really fascinating. Well, it is for me. But again, I'll go back to it. As far as I'm concerned, if we knew truly where we were, where we are, then these questions for me change greatly. A lot of the arguments still stand, but it opens up a whole new avenue. So, and it's something that I'm interested in. I like discussing. So, as I say, I'm going to put these wee clips on, and hopefully it helps anybody who's having these questions, and for people to understand that a lot of this, the religious stuff, is based on dualism. That we are something separate from the body. So and there's a whole new discussion there for me, and I'll probably do other videos on. That's why I come up with ideas and theories like this is just a technology, and somehow you're submerged within it. Like, in order for you to have experience a virtual reality, you need the mechanism to experience it, i.e., the headset. So the body or whatever could just be the same type of thing. Some sort of lens to experience this virtual reality. Um, you know, and maybe consciousness is limited within it. Who knows? It's, as I say, some of the questions in the debate still stand. Whether if we know we're in a design, whether your consciousness still survives out with the design, or whether this is some higher mind's design, and our consciousness is just a result of that creation, and it doesn't really have any other, it's not an immortal thing. And I know that's scary for people to contemplate, and it was scary for me to contemplate because, I'm a kind of hopeful dualist, if you like, where I hope that there is more and that my consciousness, will come back to, and there's other realms to discover. That's all. As I say, it's philosophy, it's subjective hopes and thoughts. But again, it's a great discussion. So, as I say, I'll put a couple of wee clips on here just to give some people an idea and maybe some avenues to look at stuff. So, enjoy. Peace.
Of how physical processes in the brain give rise to the subjective experience of the mind and of the world. If you look at the brain from the outside, you see this extraordinary machine, an organ consisting of 84 billion neurons that fire in synchrony with each other. When I see, visual inputs come to my eyes, photons hit my eyes. They send a signal that goes up the optic nerve to the back of my brain. It sends neural firings propagating throughout my brain, and eventually I might produce an action. From the outside, though, I look like a complicated mechanism, a robot. This is how science might describe me from the objective point of view. But there's also a subjective point of view. There's what it feels like for the agent who is seeing the scene. When I see you, I see colors, I see shapes, I have an experience from a first-person point of view. There's something it's like to be me. And this is the conscious experience of seeing. It's part of the inner movie of the mind. This inner movie has many, many dimensions. It has the dimension of vision, it has the dimension of sound, like a normal movie, but it also has touch and taste and smell. It has emotions. It has thought. It has a sense of one's body. All of this is subjective experience. And it's one of the most familiar facts in the world that we have this subjective experience. But it's also one of the most mysterious. Why is it that these physical processes in the brain should produce subjective experience? Why doesn't it go on in the dark without any consciousness at all? No one right now knows the answer to this question. So in the science and philosophy of consciousness, people use the word consciousness for many different things, and some of the things are easier to explain than other things. So sometimes I like to distinguish between the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem. The easy problems are not really so easy. They're as difficult as most problems in science, but it's the hard problem that's really the mystery. So sometimes we use consciousness just for the difference between being awake and being asleep. And we say, well, how is it that a system could be awake and on its feet and responding? Maybe for this, we can have an explanation in terms of the right neural mechanism in the head that produces this behavior. Eventually, we'll explain this, one of the easy problems. Well, how is it that the perceptual system can discriminate some information and respond to it? How is it the brain can monitor itself? Again, in principle, that's a question about objective processing. An explanation in terms of neurons in the brain could explain it. So for all of these, we have accepted paradigms from science, come up with some mechanism in terms of neurons that produce this behavior, then we've solved the problem. So those are the easy problems. The hard problem, by contrast, is the problem of how it is that all these processes give rise to subjective experience. And what's distinctive about this is it doesn't seem to be a problem about objective mechanisms, about, for example, behaviors that the brain produces. We could tell a complete story about the objective mechanisms in the brains, the neurons that fire, the behaviors they produce, and so on, explaining all these functions, awakeness, responsiveness, discrimination, monitoring, And there might still be a further question. Why is all that associated with subjective experience? It's just a different kind of question. I think ultimately it's a question for science, but it's a question which right now our scientific methods don't have a very good handle on. So at least for now, it's a central question for philosophy. Now, philosophy has a great history of turning its questions into science. Many of the great sciences started as areas of philosophy. Physics was originally part of philosophy until Newton developed his physical theories in the 17th century. Once he figured out how to solve it, then it became a science. Something similar happens with linguistics and psychology and economics. I would like eventually consciousness to turn into a problem for science. But first of all, philosophy needs to do its work with this problem to make it tractable. Right now, we're just in the stage where philosophy and science are cooperating on solving this problem. The scientists are now starting to think about consciousness for the first time in some years, but it's still at the level of thinking about correlations between the brain and consciousness, rather than the level of fundamental explanations. But we could hope that eventually we might have some theory of the connections between the brain and consciousness. My own view, though, is it will not be a purely reductionist or physical explanation. We won't explain consciousness purely in terms of the brain. In terms of the brain, you'll get a good solution to the easy problems, to the various behaviors, and so on. But you'll never get a full solution to the hard problem. Why is all this accompanied by experience? Rather, what we need to do is to take conscious experience itself as primitive, as a fundamental element of the world. It's the same attitude we take towards space and time and mass in physics. We don't reduce them to something more fundamental. But then we come up with fundamental laws that govern them and that can explain them. So in physics, the physicists say we're looking for fundamental theory in physics so simple, maybe you could write it on the front of a t-shirt. For consciousness, maybe we want a story of the fundamental laws connecting the brain and consciousness. So simple, we can write it on the front of a t-shirt. And the fundamental principles that connect brain processes to consciousness. Right now, we don't know what those fundamental principles might be. There are some ideas. The neuroscientist Giulio Tononi thinks it might be some principles involving integrated information. So that when the brain integrates, there's a fundamental law that says when the brain integrates enough information, then you get consciousness. I mean, this does raise many of the traditional aspects of the philosophical mind-body problem. What is the place of consciousness in the physical world, and how does it exert a causal role? Is consciousness something separate from all the brain processes that exert some effect on the brain, as many of the traditional dualists say? A view I'm attracted to is that consciousness is actually present at a fundamental level inside the brain and inside all physical processes. This is the traditional philosophical view known as panpsychism, that maybe all of physics involves some element of consciousness at the basic level. Somehow all of this composes to yield my consciousness. It's a beautiful, unified, attractive view of the world where consciousness and the physical world might be integrated all the way down. The big problem for this view is, again, another version of the hard problem, but now in the version, how can these small bits of consciousness at the fundamental level add up to the kind of single, unified conscious experience that I have? People call this the combination problem. How do the atoms of consciousness combine to yield human consciousness? Nobody right now has a solution to that problem, but at least people are thinking about it. So right now we're in a real period, I think, of ferment and excitement with many ideas about how to solve this problem. Nothing like a consensus yet. I'd be surprised if we have a consensus solution to the problem in the next 20 or 30 years, but if we're lucky, maybe within 100 years, it's possible we could have some kind of accepted philosophical / scientific theory of the hard problem of consciousness.
Dualism is a term that takes on many meanings from many different groups, but we'll consider the most prominent meaning here. These dualists believe that there are two realms, that of the physical and that of the immaterial. An early proponent of this concept was Plato, who believed that everything physical had its roots in an idea, which was not physical but immaterial. This concept was also held by the Christian Church and various other religions as they sought to make distinctions between the world around them and the spiritual realm. For some dualists, like the Gnostics, the physical realm is inherently evil and should be shunned in order to cultivate a stronger bond with the spiritual realm. Dualists believe in the existence of an immaterial aspect to mankind, most notably in the form of a soul. Dualism is also compatible with beliefs in spiritual entities such as God and angels. That said, there are dualists who do not believe in God at all.
Imagine Mary, a 23rd century neuroscientist whose field of expertise is color vision. She knows everything there is to know about how the brain processes color, but she only sees in black and white. So all of her knowledge about the color spectrum and the physiology of the eye is academic.
Now there's something left out of her account and something left out of any description of the world in purely third-person terms, namely what it feels like to see something red.
One day, Mary is released from her black and white world and given the ability to see red for the first time, to experience it consciously. Surely her first experience of color would be something she couldn't have anticipated even with all her previous knowledge. This thought experiment suggests there'll always be more to consciousness than objective observation.
Now this is the essence of consciousness. For any conscious state, there is the question, what's it feel like to be in that state? What's it like? What is the qualitative character of it? Now that's so hard for us to accept, but it's obviously true. See, our scientific tradition up to this point has tended to resist that because we think, well, no, there ought to be some neutral third-person description. And of course there are third-person descriptions of consciousness, but the essential thing about consciousness itself, the actual essence, is there's always something it feels like to be in a conscious state. If you have any doubts about that, just pinch yourself or scratch your head or hit yourself on the knee, and you will discover the existence of a qualitative state. That's the guts of consciousness.
The question, what is consciousness, ranks right up there in complexity with what is life. Even with the growing amount of scientific investigation, there's not really much we know for sure. But I know one thing. The more I find out about this, the greater my sense of wonder about my inner world and its place in the universe.
Some of the really big questions, the classic one is, why is a rose beautiful, for example? I don't know that we'll ever necessarily figure that out. And, sometimes we scientists get very arrogant. We sometimes think we know it all, or we can figure out everything, and that we've got the tools that can unlock all the mysteries of the universe. Well, maybe sometimes, and maybe not.
If we wouldn't know about consciousness, if we wouldn't have this first-person account of consciousness, we'd never believe it. But we do. We all do. At least most of us say we do. And so therefore, we need to explain it.
The answer to this question, what is consciousness, is the answer to the question, what sort of beings are we? And it's the different definitions of ourselves that's at stake when we try to get a theory of consciousness.
Stuart, here's what really fascinates me about the study of consciousness, that you look at all these smart people, scientists, philosophers, and they can't even agree where the level of hierarchy, the key area of consciousness, takes place. It starts at the lowest level of the fundamental space-time of the universe, which you might prescribe, and it goes up to the neuron, the synapse, the brain circuits, the entire brain, and then some would have it outside the brain in some non-physical way. I mean, the orders of magnitude are staggering. Why is that the case?
You put your finger on the issue. I think consciousness is scale invariant, like a fractal. It can move through all these scales like music. You know, there's high frequency, there's low, like changing octaves in a musical score. And I think consciousness occurs at different scales at the same time, or at different times at different scales. So for example, when we're enlightened or in an enhanced state of consciousness, I think consciousness actually goes to a deeper level, goes smaller, faster, more intense, inside the neuron, for example, into the quantum level where you get non-local. When you get non-locality in the quantum world, then you reach out to everywhere. So then you have, in principle, the whole universe, and non-locality, and interaction between people, consciousness outside the brain.
So you believe that's a real possibility?
Definitely, yes. I think it's a possibility. I can't prove it, but I think there's enough evidence for end-of-life brain activity, these near-death and out-of-body experiences, and so forth. We can't rule out consciousness out of the brain until we have a true understanding of consciousness in the brain. I think consciousness in the brain is a quantum effect that is connected to the fine scale structure of the universe at the Planck scale, which is non-local, which means it's everywhere. So, for example,
do you realize what a radical claim that is? You're saying it like it's like you're describing something normal in the world. I mean, that is the most radical claim that I've heard, and some people, myself included, might think it's absurd.
As I said, until we can explain consciousness in the brain, we can't rule out consciousness as the quantum non-local effect out of the brain. And I don't take that lightly. I take it from, I don't make that statement lightly. I take it from evidence for near-death out-of-body experiences, some circumstantial evidences for afterlife. I don't claim that that's true. I just say it's conceivable, it's plausible that consciousness could exist in the fine scale structure of Planck scale geometry, which is everywhere. This could account for parapsychology, backward time effects that we see in Libet and in experiments of backward time effects, non-locality of various...
I mean, throwing out a lot of terms that sound like they're very normal scientific terms, but they are extremely peripheral in terms of traditional science.
If consciousness is truly a quantum effect, as Penrose and I believe, it opens a Pandora's box for mainstream classical science.
All right, so let's get into that, because this is important, because most people would agree with you that there's this fractal effect, that consciousness exists at every level, but the vast majority, certainly of neuroscientists who I know, and from the field that I'm from, would stop at a level of perhaps the synapse, that maybe it exists in some total brain function.
To explain the paramecium.
Look, I mean, they have to explain a lot of things, but let's just say where they are now.
Okay.
That they are whole brain circuits. Individuals said that it stops at the sin. They said anything below that, there's no information. It's just the normal structure of the world. Just like there's a structure in this table, there has to be a structure in the neuron. There has to be, quantum mechanical base, because everything is quantum mechanical base. But you're trying to sound scientific by using quantum mechanics when it's impossible to go below. Now that's the claim. And the burden's on you to explain why you believe what you believe.
I'm more scientific than they are. They can't explain a paramecium, which is a single-cell organism that doesn't have any synapses. So if consciousness is an emergent property of synaptic interactions, then how do you explain a single-cell organism? How do they explain memory? Because the synaptic plasticity, which is where memory is thought to be in conventional mainstream approaches, the synaptic proteins last hours to days, and yet memories can last lifetimes. It looks like memories stored in the microtubules, in the cytoskeleton, inside neurons. So we have memory there. We have the paramecium. We have the fact that conventional approaches completely fail in explaining consciousness. They either get rid of it or say it's epiphenomenal or just blow it off entirely.
I will totally agree with you on that.
Okay.
That I think everything I've heard, and I think I know pretty much how the whole systems work. I think it all fails. I don't have any one.
Okay. Ours doesn't fail.
So you have to convince me of that. I'm less convinced of yours than I might be of others, but nothing has won my vote so far.
Okay.
So pitch me.
So each neuron has about 10 to the 9th subunits of microtubules. They can switch at about 10 megahertz.
That's about a billion.
It's a billion, and they can switch at about 10 million per second, which gives you 10 to the 16th operations per second per neuron. Now, potentially. Mainstream approaches to the brain say 100 billion neurons switching at about 1,000 synapses, 100 times a second gives you about 10 to the 16th operations per second for the whole brain. So what we're saying is the capacity of each neuron is equivalent to what they're saying the brain is. Now that per se doesn't buy you anything, because that's just more computation, that's just more reductionism. And in fact, that's where I was in about 1990, talking about microtubules as information processing for 20 years, going around saying, you guys need to go down inside to the microtubule level for all this capacity. And somebody said, well, how would that explain consciousness? How would that explain love, joy, fear, pain, what's now known as the heart problem? And I had to admit, I didn't know. It was a very good question. I was kind of stymied. I took a long figurative look at myself in the mirror and said, I'm a reductionist. Consciousness has slipped away. Fortunately, that same person suggested I read Roger Penrose's book, The Emperor's New Mind, which was a lot of things. It was a slap in the face to AI. It was a resolution of the measurement problem. It was kind of a merger of general relativity and quantum mechanics. But he had a proposed mechanism for consciousness based on a particular type of quantum state collapse, a type of quantum computing in the brain. And he argued that this connected the brain activities to the fundamental level of the universe where consciousness and Platonic values could be embedded. I was pretty much blown away by that book. I didn't grok it all. I didn't really understand everything, but I intuitively felt right. And in the end, it was audacious and bold, and he had a mechanism which is still today the only proposed mechanism for consciousness that's ever been put forth, a type of collapse of the wave function. But he didn't have a structure in the brain to be a quantum computer. I had a structure that I've been studying for 20 years, microtubules, which could be quantum. And in fact, anesthetics act by quantum level effects to take away consciousness. So the quantum thing appealed to me. So he had a structure, he had a mechanism, not a structure. I had a structure, not a mechanism. We teamed up and developed our theory in the early 90s, which was attacked immediately by the mainstream neuroscientists for all kinds of reasons. But 20 years later, it's been 20 years at this point since our theory came out. The evidence is accruing on our side. We now know that from the work of Anirban Bandyapati in Japan, that microtubules have quantum resonances at warm temperature. We know that plants' photosynthesis use quantum coherence at warm temperature. Quantum coherence in biology is everywhere. Why? If a tomato or rutabaga can figure out how to use quantum coherence, wouldn't our brains be able to do so?
Well, look, I think this is an issue that's an open issue, but most traditional people think that the quantum effects are effects in everything. They're underlying all matter in everything that happens.
Well, the question
and
is,
so
at
the question is, why is that more important in the brain than it is in this table or in the grass?
Because microtubules are designed to have macroscopic, or at least mesoscopic, quantum states. Because the individual tubulins have a quantum channel of aromatic amino acids, where we now know anesthetics act to erase consciousness, that hook up with the neighbor tubulins and throughout a helical pathway in the microtubule. So you get a quantum channel that goes the length of a microtubule, which in axons can be a meter. In dendrites, they're short and interrupted. But at least you have mesoscopic quantum states that can last, according to Anirban's results, at least a 10,000th of a second, which is long enough for what we need.
I think it's an interesting argument, and I think it's an important argument. I can't adjudicate it. I know most people don't agree with it, but that doesn't mean it's right, because nobody has a real solution. I have a different question. I would say, suppose you're right. Suppose that the quantum effect is working, and everything you say, all the crazy things you say, are absolutely right. It still looks like identity theory, and identity theory says that it's the same thing. It's the same guys who talk about identity theory in the brain, where you have circuitry is the green color of your shirt. It's not. I mean, it's the same thing. It's like calling Venus the morning star and the evening star. It's the same thing. And that just seems inconceivable that this experience of your green shirt is the same thing as this quantum microtubule games that you're playing.
It has to be something, Robert. And the qualia, the greenness, we attribute to properties at the fundamental level of the universe, at the Planck scale, space-time geometry, where they are irreducible components. The same level that gives us mass, spin, charge, other mysteries. How do we explain spin? How do we explain the charge of an electron? How do we explain mass? It's curvature in space-time geometry. Space-time geometry.
So is your argument that consciousness is so strange and so fundamental to the world that you have to go down to the lowest level of the fundamental, irreducible building blocks of the universe, like spin and charge and the most fundamental things?
Not because it's so strange, just because that's where the logic leads you. I mean, as Roger once said, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever's left must be correct, no matter how seemingly improbable. Actually, Sherlock Holmes said it, and he quoted him. So it's not crazy. It's not. It's just that's where the path has led. And we have a theory that works. Evidence backs us up. Anesthesia is now shown to work on microtubules. Honorbond's results show that microtubules are quantum resonance structures at warm temperature. We have evidence on our side. These other guys are hand-waving about complexity, and it doesn't really make any sense what they're saying.
Others would say that everyone's right when they say that everyone else is wrong. So you're right that Christoph is wrong, and Christoph's right that you're wrong. And what you really need to do is you need to go outside the physical world. You need to go to a non-material explanation, or you will never explain consciousness.
Well, outside the physical world doesn't mean immaterial. I'm a physicalist, but not a materialist. Christoph would say that consciousness is a property of matter. I would say that matter is a property of quantum collapse. You have quantum collapse that gives matter in a particular state. Constantly, that's happening in our world. So I go below the level of matter to quantum and say that consciousness happens in the collapse within the microtubules that choose a particular state of the matter of the tubulin subunits.
Yeah, but you're still saying that something is happening there. As a physicalist, that is the experience of green. That is it. It's not what causes it. What is it? And that's identity theory. And some people just say that's on its surface absurd. And therefore, you have to go outside the physicalist world. You have to go to something non-physical, not just non-material, but non-physical.
So now you're talking like Deepak.
I'm not. I'm talking like me.
Okay.
Nobody controls what I say.
So Deepak Chopra and I have had this discussion. He comes from Vedanta. He said consciousness is outside space and time. And I disagree with that. There's no reason to do that. Everything he needs for the magic and mystical nature of Vedanta and spirituality can be gotten at the level of Planck scale geometry, non-locality, and Platonic values embedded in fundamental reality.
Yeah, this is not about giving people what they want to serve their own interests, because that's irrelevant. It's what do you need to explain it? That's all I care about.
I'm with you. Closer to truth.
Materialists like to think of themselves as taking the rational high ground, as having the strongest logical position. Yet it is surprising how materialists often lack in the most basic clear thinking and logical rigor. In this video, I want to discuss the top 10 most fallacious arguments that materialists use and explain why they are all very, very wrong. All these arguments have been used by materialists in the real world. I haven't invented them. I hope you have fun.
Because we cannot change reality by merely wishing it to be different, it is clear that reality is outside consciousness.
Well, the fallacy here is to infer that whatever is not within the scope of our conscious volition, of our conscious wishes, is outside consciousness itself. That's a clear fallacy. In fact, our human psyche clearly has vast segments which do not fall under the control of egoic volition, of our conscious wishes. Otherwise, nobody would have a nightmare. Nobody would have psychotic hallucinations. Nobody would even be neurotic. The fact that these things happen show that large segments of our psyches are not under the control of our volition. And in that sense, it's very reasonable to expect that reality itself could be generated by a part of consciousness, a segment of consciousness, that is not under the control of volition.
Reality is clearly not inside our heads. Therefore, you were wrong.
Well, that's a very nice one, because it completely inverts the argument and defeats materialism itself. It is materialism that says that the reality we experience, all the colors, shapes, sounds, flavors, they are all inside our heads because they are created by our brains, according to materialism. The real reality, still according to materialism, is an abstract realm akin to mathematical equations. What I am saying is that reality is generated by consciousness itself. As such, it is our heads that are in reality, not reality in our heads. It is the human body that is in consciousness, not consciousness in the human body.
That cannot be because there are strong correlations between brain activity and subjective experience. Clearly, therefore, the brain generates consciousness.
Well, the flaw here is to mistake the image of a process for the cause of the process. The body-brain system is the image of a process of consciousness localization. in the same way that a whirlpool is the image of a process of water localization. There is nothing to a whirlpool but water. In the same way, there is nothing to the body-brain system but consciousness. The brain does not generate consciousness for exactly the same reason that a whirlpool does not generate water. Yet, of course, the image of a process correlates very well with the inner workings of the process. Flames are the image of combustion, seen from the outside. It correlates very well with the microscopic process that we call combustion. The image of the process correlates with it, and that's why brain activity correlates with the first-person view of subjective experience.
Because psychoactive drugs change subjective experience, it is clear that the brain generates consciousness.
Well, the fallacy here is to assume a form of dualism implicitly. Think of it this way. Is there any problem to say that our thoughts influence our emotions? There's no problem with that, right? After all, thoughts are a process in consciousness, and they can influence another process in consciousness, namely emotions. One process in consciousness influencing another process in consciousness. No problem. Now, if I take a drug in the form of a pill or a liquid, if all reality is in consciousness, then that pill, that liquid, is the image of a process in consciousness. What else could it be? If that pill or that liquid that I ingest interferes with my subjective experience, for instance, my alertness, what I have is a process in consciousness, namely a pill, influencing another process in consciousness, namely my alertness. For the same reason that there's no problem about thoughts influencing emotions, there's no problem about drugs influencing our subjective experience of reality.
Because we are separate beings partaking in the same reality, reality has to be outside consciousness.
Well, the fallacy here is what philosophers call begging the question. What materialists are doing here is assuming materialism in their argument to defend materialism. It is only if you assume materialism that you can say that our psyches, that we are separate beings, because our bodies are clearly separate. But if reality is in consciousness, then our bodies are in consciousness, not consciousness in our bodies. Therefore, the fact that our bodies are separate does not imply that our psyches, our minds, are separate at the deepest levels, at the level of a collective unconscious that may be generating our consensus reality in the same way that our unconscious minds generate our dreams. But in the case of consensus reality, the collective unconscious may be generating a collective dream.
The separation between consciousness and unconsciousness is dualist nonsense.
Well, there is actually some value to this question. The problem is that it misunderstands what the unconscious is. The unconscious is not a fundamentally different thing from consciousness. The unconscious is actually conscious. It is just an obfuscated part of consciousness. What we call ordinary consciousness is a self-reflective mode of consciousness which amplifies mental contents to an enormous level. That amplification obfuscates everything else going on in mind, in the depths of mind, much in the same way that sunlight at noon refracting on the atmosphere obfuscates the stars. The stars are all there on a clear day at noon. Their photons are still hitting your retina, but you don't see them because they are obfuscated by the much stronger glare of the sun. What we call egoic consciousness, our ordinary consciousness, is like the glare of the sun. It's very strong and it obfuscates what we would then refer to as the, quote, unconscious. But the unconscious and consciousness are fundamentally of the same nature. There is no fundamental divide, no fundamental dualism between the two. One does not magically emerge from the other. It's a relative difference, a difference of relative amplification of mental contents.
Because reality behaves according to immutable laws, it cannot be generated by consciousness.
Well, the fallacy here is to assume that all modes of consciousness are as unpredictable as egoic consciousness, our normal awareness. There's nothing in the idea I'm putting forward that reality is fundamentally a mental phenomenon, a phenomenon in consciousness. There's nothing in it that precludes the possibility that segments of consciousness unfold according to very strict patterns and regularities, which we have come to call the laws of physics. As such, our collective unconscious, by generating reality, does that according to these very strict patterns and regularities.
Then, to say that a collective unconscious generates reality is equivalent to saying that reality is outside consciousness.
No, it is not equivalent at all. Even if the collective unconscious generates reality in the same way that it generates dreams, but in the case of consensus reality, it generates it according to very strict, stable patterns and regularities, which we call the laws of physics. Even in that case, there is a profound difference in these worldviews. According to materialism, consciousness is created by particular arrangements of matter in the brain. So when you die and your brain dissolves, your consciousness will disappear. But if the brain is in consciousness, as opposed to consciousness in the brain, and if the brain is merely the image of a process of consciousness localization, then physical death means that consciousness is delocalizing, is declenching, broadening in scope, and physical death does not imply the end of consciousness.
This idea of consciousness generating reality is too metaphysical.
Oh, I love this one because it's completely ridiculous. It is materialism that entails an incredible metaphysics. It is materialism that states that the real reality, the reality outside your head, has no shape, color, smell, taste. That shape, color, smell, and taste are all generated by your brain inside your skull. And that the real reality is a completely abstract realm, akin to sets of mathematical equations, which has none of the qualities of experience. That is profoundly metaphysical, unknowable, and unprovable. Even spiritual realms are less metaphysical than that, because spiritual people hope to one day be able to experience those realms, maybe after death. But the real world of materialism, by definition, can never even be known, because knowledge exists only in consciousness, and the reality of materialists is supposedly outside consciousness. If anything, the notion that reality is a phenomenon of consciousness is anti-metaphysical. It is that notion that states that reality is exactly what it seems, that reality is outside your head, the reality that you experience is outside your head, not inside your head, that colors, smells, tastes, forms, they are all real and not reproductions generated by your brain. This is what this notion I'm putting forward entails. It entails that reality is what it seems. It is not metaphysical, it is concrete, because concreteness is a quality of experience, not of abstractions.
Why would consciousness deceive us by simulating a materialist world?
Now, this is the ultimate in prejudice and blindness. It reveals an incredible inability to see past one's own assumptions. Consciousness is not simulating a materialist world. Consciousness is simply doing what it does, and what it does happens to be the universe. That consciousness generates the universe requires no more complexity, no extra assumption than the idea that the laws of physics, also irreducible, generate the universe. In the same way that the laws of physics supposedly generate the universe because of their own nature, because of what they intrinsically are in an irreducible manner, consciousness generates the universe because of its own nature, unfolding according to stable patterns and regularities. So in summary, materialism requires many more postulates, many more assumptions than the idea that it is consciousness that is creating reality as a fundamentally subjective phenomenon. The arguments materialists use to defend their thesis can all be defeated one by one with just clear thinking and simple logic. We do not require the assumptions of materialism to make sense of the world. Everything can be explained, including the correlations between brain activity and subjective experience, the impact that psychoactive drugs have on subjective experience, the fact that we share the same reality, the fact that the laws of physics are so stable and immutable. All of this can be made sense of with many less assumptions, much less complexity, and in a way that does justice to our immediate experience of reality, in a way that does justice to our intuitions about reality. What I'm putting forward entails that reality is exactly what it seems to be, a phenomenon with the qualities of experience, not a reproduction inside your head. It so happens that it also has the inescapable consequence that your consciousness will never disappear, that your physical death will entail a declenching, a delocalization of consciousness. And for some reason, that is not very palatable to materialists. I think materialism has survived for so long, for the past, 300-400 years, despite the fact that it is so wrong, because it immerses you in a network of hidden assumptions and hidden prejudices that makes one unable to see past that tiny box, to see past that set of temporary and flawed conclusions, and have a broader view at reality. Usually materialists, when they hear me explain these things, they project a lot more complexity onto what I am saying than what I actually mean. What I'm saying is extremely simple. I'm not talking about religious stuff. I'm not talking about New Age stuff. I'm talking about a very simple, surprisingly simple interpretation of reality that requires less assumptions, is more parsimonious, and does more justice to our intuitions.